How does a republic come to believe that another state cannot be allowed to exist? In 146 BC, after over a century of rivalry, Rome erased Carthage from the map. The city was burned, its population killed or sold into slavery, and its territory reorganized as the Roman province of Africa. One of the great powers of the Western Mediterranean disappeared, a city whose military harbor had shipyards built to hold 220 vessels. The destruction itself is not the mystery. Cities fall in war. States lose conflicts and are absorbed. The harder question is why Rome chose elimination instead of control. Why not impose another payment? Why not tighten restrictions again? Why insist that the city itself be removed? Welcome to Time Prime History. Today we are tracing how that decision was made, not in 146 BC, but over a century of war, humiliation, and institutional memory that left Rome believing coexistence itself was a risk it could not afford. By the time of the final war, Carthage was not invading Italy or commanding large fleets. It had surrendered its empire decades earlier, paid enormous silver penalties to Rome, and accepted strict limits on its military. It could not wage war without Roman approval. Economically, it was recovering, but politically, it was contained. Yet Rome concluded that containment was not enough. That decision did not appear suddenly in 146 BC. It developed over decades, shaped by earlier wars, by the memory of catastrophic defeats, and by a republic that survived a near-death experience and drew a permanent lesson from it. To understand why Rome thought it had to eliminate Carthage, we have to return to the period when both states were still learning what security required and how far they were willing to go to guarantee it. By the 3rd century BC, the Western Mediterranean was already a crowded and competitive world. It was not empty land waiting to be conquered. It was a network of ports, fortified cities, and maritime trade routes linking North Africa, Iberia, Italy, and the islands between them. At the center stood Carthage, founded in the 9th century BC by Phoenician settlers, traders from the Levantine coast in what is now Lebanon. It had grown into one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean, likely housing between 200,000 and 300,000 people. From its North African harbors, fleets moved constantly to Iberia, Sardinia, Corsica, and western Sicily. Iberian silver mines generated immense revenue, and tribute from dependent territories strengthened its treasury. At its height, Carthage could field hundreds of warships. Its power rested on controlling sea lanes and key coastal positions rather than vast inland conquests. Its political structure reflected that commercial base. Carthage was a republic led by 2 annually elected magistrates, advised by a powerful council of elders and influenced by citizen assemblies. Real influence rested with merchant families whose wealth depended on stability. War was expensive. Disruption to trade meant disruption to revenue. Campaigns had to justify their cost. Expansion was measured and pragmatic. Its armies mirrored that logic. Carthage relied heavily on foreign and subject troops, Iberians, Numidians, Libyans, and Gauls, recruited through pay and alliance. In major campaigns, it could assemble armies of 40,000 to 60,000 men, but most were not citizens. Loyalty was contractual. Command frequently rested with powerful families such as the Barcids, whose military success translated into political leverage. Over time, authority abroad could reinforce influence at home. Rome was also a republic, but built on different foundations. By the early 3rd century BC, Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula and had integrated a large network of allied communities. According to Roman census figures from the period, Rome and its Italian allies could draw from a pool of roughly 600,000 men of military age. That was not a permanent standing army, but it represented extraordinary mobilization capacity, especially compared to Carthage, whose large expeditionary armies were typically assembled through paid and subject contingents rather than citizen mass levy. Roman legions were composed primarily of citizens, and service was tied to property, duty, and status. Political offices rotated annually, yet the Senate provided continuity, and elite families returned generation after generation. Because of this system, Rome could suffer heavy losses, and still raise new armies without collapsing politically. The difference between the two republics was already visible in how they handled conflict. Carthage tended to favor negotiated settlements and financial indemnities that restored commercial balance. Rome preferred outcomes that permanently shifted power, redrawing political realities in ways that reduced future threats. Both sought security, but one defined it as restored equilibrium, while the other defined it as structural advantage. Sicily sat between them, and in Sicily, those theories collided. The First Punic War began in 264 BC with a crisis in the Sicilian city of Messana. A band of mercenaries had seized the city and appealed for help against Syracuse. Both Carthage and Rome understood that the city meant the strait, the narrow crossing between Sicily and the Italian mainland. Carthage responded first, installing a garrison. Rome intervened soon after, unwilling to accept Carthaginian military presence so close to Italy. What began as a local dispute forced two republics into open war over strategic geography. At the outset, Carthage held the advantage at sea. Its navy had dominated Western Mediterranean waters for generations. Its crews were experienced, its shipyards established, its supply lines mature. Rome had almost no naval tradition. It was a land power accustomed to fighting in Italy. Yet once committed, Rome adapted at extraordinary scale. Over the course of the war, it built roughly 1,000 warships. It copied Carthaginian designs and introduced the corvus, a boarding bridge mounted at the prow, dropped by pulleys, with a heavy iron spike that bit into an enemy deck and locked the two ships together. Naval combat became infantry combat, a fight Rome understood. The learning process was punishing. In 255 BC, around 280 Roman ships were destroyed in a single storm after an African campaign. Tens of thousands of men were lost at sea. Similar disasters followed. Each time, Rome rebuilt, drawing on its manpower reserves and Italian allies. The war became a test of institutional endurance. For Carthage, the conflict disrupted the foundation of its wealth. Naval warfare strained trade networks and revenue streams. As the balance shifted over 2 decades, Carthaginian leaders explored negotiated settlements to restore stability. Rome increasingly pressed for structural change. Peace would not simply reopen trade, it would redefine control. The decisive moment came in 241 BC at the Battle of the Aegates Islands. Rome's rebuilt fleet defeated a Carthaginian force attempting to resupply Sicily. Facing exhaustion and financial strain, Carthage sued for peace. The terms were severe. Sicily was surrendered outright, becoming Rome's first overseas province. Carthage agreed to pay 3,200 talents of silver, roughly 80 metric tons. To put that in context, 1 talent was roughly the cost of maintaining a warship for a month. 3,200 talents was enough to fund a fleet of 270 warships for nearly a year. Rome was not just taking silver, it was taking Carthage's ability to fight back. The consequences did not stop with the treaty. When Carthage struggled to pay its mercenaries and descended into internal revolt, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica under threat of renewed war and imposed an additional 1,200 talents, roughly 30 metric tons of silver, on top of what was already owed. Carthage had accepted the peace terms. It had complied. It was already paying. None of that mattered. Rome expanded the moment weakness appeared. The First Punic War left Carthage stripped of its islands, buried in debt, and with a lesson it would not forget. Compliance did not guarantee safety. The First Punic War ended with Carthage burdened by heavy indemnities and stripped of Sicily, but the most immediate threat came from its own army. Much of Carthage's wartime force had been composed of foreign mercenaries commanded by Carthaginian generals. When the treasury, strained by defeat, and the 3,200 talent indemnity owed to Rome delayed payment, those troops revolted. What followed became known as the Mercenary Crisis, or the Truceless War, a brutal conflict fought from 241 to 237 BC. Rebel forces, joined by discontented African subjects, threatened Carthaginian territory and nearly isolated the city itself. The state faced the possibility of internal collapse. Carthage appointed Hamilcar Barca, a prominent general who had commanded forces in Sicily during the First Punic War, to lead the counter-offensive. Within the government, debate continued over whether to negotiate or crush the rebellion outright. Hamilcar represented the hardline response. He turned mercenary factions against each other, cut rebel supply lines, and trapped isolated forces until they had no choice but to surrender or die. The suppression was severe, but it saved the state and significantly elevated Hamilcar's standing within Carthaginian politics. After restoring order, Hamilcar did not retire. Instead, he led an expedition to Iberia around 237 BC, officially as a Carthaginian general acting on behalf of the Republic. In practice, he operated with substantial autonomy. Iberia offered silver mines, manpower, and distance from Roman oversight. Over the next years, the Barcid family established fortified positions, secured alliances, and expanded Carthaginian influence deep into the peninsula. Revenue and troops flowed from this new sphere, strengthening Carthage, while concentrating power in the hands of one family. Iberia functioned as a semi-independent Barcid base, formally Carthaginian but practically controlled by its commanders. Rome did not interfere during this expansion. It observed from a distance as Carthage rebuilt its strength beyond the immediate reach of Italian politics. According to later tradition, during these campaigns in Iberia, Hamilcar made his young son Hannibal swear eternal hostility toward Rome. The story may be legend, but it reflects something real. That son would grow up to lead an army across the Alps into Italy and bring Rome closer to destruction than any enemy in its history. The humiliation of defeat had not faded. It had been absorbed. The next war would not be accidental. Carthage's rebuilding in Iberia after the First Punic War was not quiet recovery. It was strategic repositioning. Spain offered manpower, fortified cities, and, most importantly, silver. The mines around New Carthage, the main Barcid stronghold on the Iberian coast, produced enormous wealth and funded the rebuilding of Carthaginian military power. In 226 BC, Rome and Carthage agreed that the Ebro River would mark the northern limit of Carthaginian expansion. But south of that line stood Saguntum, a wealthy Iberian city that chose to align itself with Rome. In 219 BC, Hannibal besieged Saguntum. After 8 months, the city fell. Rome demanded Hannibal's surrender. Carthage refused. War followed. In 218 BC, Hannibal chose a strategy Rome did not anticipate. Instead of fighting by sea, where Rome had improved, he marched north with a large army, crossed the Pyrenees, moved through southern Gaul, and then led his forces over the Alps into Italy. Ancient sources give figures in the tens of thousands, but the crossing cost him nearly half his force regardless. An enemy army had appeared inside Italy itself. The early campaigns were devastating. At the Trebia River in 218 BC, Hannibal defeated a Roman army through maneuver and surprise. In 217 BC at Lake Trasimene, he ambushed another force and destroyed it. Then in 216 BC at Cannae, he executed one of the most lethal battlefield encirclements in history. Facing roughly 80,000 Romans, Hannibal surrounded and crushed them. Between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers died in a single day. 80 senators or men of senatorial rank died alongside senior commanders. The Republic had suffered a trauma few states survive. Some allies defected. Capua, one of Rome's largest cities, switched sides. Parts of southern Italy wavered. Syracuse in Sicily joined Carthage. Rome responded with systematic force. Syracuse was besieged and destroyed in 212 BC. Archimedes was killed during the capture. Rebellion was not negotiated. It was removed. Yet the core of Rome's alliance network held firm. Central Italy remained loyal. Despite massive losses, Rome's manpower reserves allowed it to raise new armies year after year. After Cannae, Rome did not collapse. The Senate refused to ransom prisoners. No peace party prevailed. Instead, strategy shifted back toward the approach already associated with Quintus Fabius Maximus, the dictator appointed after Trasimene. Avoid decisive battle focus on attrition, stretch the war across years, and deny Hannibal a final victory. Hannibal waited for reinforcements that never truly came. Carthage's leadership was divided, its armies dispersed across Spain, Sicily, and Africa, and Rome's fleets controlled the sea routes that could have sustained a larger invasion of Italy. The war was no longer about battlefield brilliance. It was about supply and coordination, and Rome held the advantage. In 207 BC, Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal Barca, attempted to break the stalemate by marching from Spain across the Alps to join him. Roman forces intercepted him at the Metaurus River and destroyed his army. Hasdrubal was killed, and his severed head was thrown into Hannibal's camp. Any realistic chance of uniting the two Carthaginian armies in Italy died with him. Meanwhile, Rome attacked the foundations of Carthaginian power. In 206 BC, Roman forces under Publius Cornelius Scipio defeated Carthage at the Battle of Ilipa in Spain. With that defeat, Carthage lost control of Iberia and the silver mines that had financed its military recovery. Rome now controlled that wealth. Scipio then invaded North Africa in 204 BC, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal after more than 15 years in Italy. The final battle came in 202 BC at Zama. Scipio reorganized his legions to prevent encirclement and secured the support of Numidian cavalry. Those horsemen rode under Massinissa, king of Numidia, an ally Rome had cultivated specifically to counter Carthaginian power in North Africa. The same type of cavalry that had helped destroy Roman armies earlier in the war, now fought on Rome's side. Hannibal was defeated on Carthaginian soil. The peace settlement stripped Carthage of its power. It surrendered its fleet, retaining only 10 warships. It lost Spain and all remaining overseas territories, including the Iberian silver mines that had funded its armies. It was required to pay Rome 10,000 talents of silver over 50 years, roughly 260 metric tons, more than 500,000 pounds, delivered in annual payments. It could not wage war without Roman approval. Carthage survived the Second Punic War, but survival came with conditions that stripped it of sovereignty. It retained its walls and its name, yet its future decisions no longer fully belonged to it. It survived without empire, without its primary source of military revenue, and without the freedom to defend itself independently. After Zama, Carthage did not resist the new order. It adapted to it. Its fleet was reduced to 10 ships. Spain and the Iberian silver mines that had financed its armies were gone. It could not wage war without Roman approval. What remained was the land around the city itself, and Carthage turned that land into its foundation. The fertile plains of North Africa were intensively cultivated, irrigation expanded, and agricultural production increased dramatically. Grain exports flowed across the Mediterranean. Trade continued within limits. Even while paying Rome's enormous indemnity, wealth accumulated steadily. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, Carthage was no longer an imperial power, but it was economically strong despite the loss of empire. Its military position, however, remained tightly constrained. The treaty still stood. Carthage was not permitted to fight without Roman consent, and for decades it followed that rule. When tensions rose along its borders with Numidia, the neighboring kingdom led by Massinissa, whose Numidian cavalry had once been central to Carthaginian battlefield power, Carthage initially chose negotiation over mobilization. Massinissa, backed politically by Rome, steadily pushed into disputed territories. Because the treaty system prevented Carthage from responding militarily on its own, Rome became the de facto arbiter of these disputes. Roman commissions were sent to arbitrate conflicts, and their rulings repeatedly favored Numidia. Land shifted incrementally over time. Carthage protested through legal channels and accepted the outcomes rather than escalate into open war. This arrangement produced a surface stability. Carthage complied. Rome supervised. Numidia advanced. Yet economic recovery began to change how the situation looked from Rome. When Cato the Elder, a senator whose voice carried enormous moral authority, visited Carthage, he did not see a defeated remnant locked into permanent weakness. He saw fertile fields under cultivation, markets operating efficiently, and a city capable of generating wealth without Spanish silver or a restored fleet. To him, recovery was not reassurance, it was warning. Returning prosperity meant returning capacity, and returning capacity meant that the rival, who had once marched through Italy, might, given time, do so again. From that point forward, Cato ended his speeches with the same conclusion: Carthage must be destroyed. Inside the Roman Senate, the logic of security began to shift. The question was no longer whether Carthage was obeying restrictions, it was whether a former rival that had once marched through Italy should be allowed decades of uninterrupted growth. Compliance no longer guaranteed safety. It suggested resilience. And in a republic shaped by the memory of Hannibal, by the afternoon at Cannae when tens of thousands fell and the state nearly fractured, resilience could look less like obedience and more like a rival rebuilding strength in silence, waiting for its moment. The final war did not begin with invasion. It began with pressure. Massinissa, king of Numidia and Rome's longtime North African ally since the defeat of Hannibal at Zama, had steadily expanded his kingdom into territory claimed by Carthage. Roman arbitration commissions repeatedly ruled in his favor. The arrangement suited Rome. Numidia weakened Carthage without Rome having to commit major forces. By 149 BC, after years of incremental losses, Carthage resisted Numidian expansion without first securing Roman approval. Under the treaty imposed after the Second Punic War, that decision violated the agreement. Rome declared war. Carthage initially attempted submission. Members of the city's leading families were handed over as hostages to Roman commanders. The city then complied again when Rome demanded disarmament, delivering vast stores of weapons and military equipment in the hope that obedience would preserve the city. Only after Carthage had surrendered its leverage did Rome reveal its final demand. The populations must abandon the coastal city entirely and relocate inland, no more than 10 miles from the sea. The harbour that had powered its trade for centuries, the defensive walls that had protected it, the urban centre itself, all were to be relinquished. This was not a demand for adjustment. It was a demand that the city cease to exist in its current form. Inside the city, debate fractured the leadership. Some argued that survival, even without the harbour and walls, was preferable to total loss. Others insisted that leaving the city meant surrendering Carthage's identity. Resistance prevailed, and the city entrusted its defence to Hasdrubal, a Carthaginian general whose title, the Boethar, meant roughly the city's chief protector. The siege that followed lasted nearly 3 years. Roman forces surrounded the city by land and sea. Within the walls, citizens dismantled their own homes for timber to reinforce defences. Metal from tools and household goods was reshaped into weapons. As supplies dwindled, conditions grew increasingly severe. Hasdrubal, under immense pressure, at times pursued negotiations while fighting continued, a final reflection of Carthage's recurring internal divisions. Roman command eventually passed to Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, who had defeated Hannibal at Zama. The war had now come full circle. Scipio Aemilianus understood that this campaign was not about extracting concessions. It was about ending the rival state permanently. In 146 BC, Roman forces broke through the defences and fought through Carthage for several days. Ancient sources record extensive loss of life and the displacement of much of the population. Fires spread through large parts of the city. When the fighting ended, Carthage no longer existed as an independent power. Its territory was reorganized as the Roman province of Africa. In that same year, Rome also defeated Corinth in Greece after suppressing a rebellion by the Achaean League. Corinth was captured, its population dispersed, and its wealth taken. The message in both cases was unmistakable. Resistance would not be negotiated, it would be brought to an end. By 146 BC, no Western peer competitor remained. The republic that survived Cannae drew a lasting conclusion from that experience. Rome had come within reach of collapse. Entire armies had been destroyed. Allies had defected. An enemy general had marched freely across Italy for more than a decade. Survival had not been guaranteed. It had been wrestled back through endurance, manpower, and institutional discipline. That memory did not fade. It shaped policy. From Rome's perspective, the danger had never been Carthage at its weakest. The danger had been Carthage at its strongest, organized, financed, and capable of coordinating armies across continents. The lesson absorbed was not simply to defeat a rival in battle, it was to prevent any rival from reaching that level again. Carthage in the mid-2nd century BC was not collapsing. It was rebuilding economically. It was stable. It was compliant. That was precisely the problem. A city that regained wealth could, in time, regain power. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BC was not an act of desperation. It was a strategic decision rooted in memory. The republic that had endured Hannibal concluded that coexistence with a capable peer carried unacceptable risk. Elimination was safer than management. In 146 BC, Carthage and Corinth became the precedent. Established centers of power had to be removed, not merely defeated, when Rome judged the long-term risk unacceptable. After 146 B Wing or C, coexistence was no longer a stable condition in Roman foreign policy. It was only temporary. How does a republic come to believe that another state cannot be allowed to exist? It happens when survival is remembered not as triumph, but as near collapse. And when that memory convinces a state that the safest rival is no rival at all. Thank you for exploring the fall of Carthage with us. Like and follow for more Time Prime history.